There you are. Have you brought me some more walnuts? Just leave them there, I'll crack them in a minute. Do you have to rush back? It's just that I've been remembering a story and I wondered if I could share it with you if you have a moment. There was a beautiful prioress, daughter to a noble lord, devoted to God. So when it came time for her to marry, she requested that her father allow her to marry God, and she became a nun. She was so dedicated to her work, and kind and generous in her nature, it wasn't long before she became the prioress, the nun in charge of the priory, home to many other nuns. Her beauty had always attracted men to her side, and there were still 3 who came to see her, to see if she'd had a change of mind and if she would fall in love and wish to marry. The 3 men were very different in nature. Each day she would receive a visit from a knight who was elegant, handsome, brave and dramatic. He would talk to her of his love for her, tell her stories and sing her songs. In truth, he would have stayed with her all day if she didn't eventually hush him with a smile and receive gracefully the gift that he had brought her. The knight would go hunting and bring her most of his bag, deer and rabbits for her and the other nuns to eat. He fed them very well. Twice a week, Pastor John would come to visit, a quiet, kind, gentle man who said very little. He would have stayed all day, gazing at the prioress, if she didn't eventually coax him into offering his gift and then usher him out of the room. Pastor John would bring her and the other nuns wine from his extensive cellar. Once a week, she would receive a visit from a lusty merchant who would bang on the door with his strong hand before striding into the room and throwing his great weight into a chair. He would talk to her of his work, of the weather, of travel, endlessly, until eventually, stifling a yawn, the prioress would marvel at his ability to trade, which would prompt him to offer up his gift and then heave his girth up and out. The merchant, whenever he visited, brought a bag of gold. Now, the prioress knew she shouldn't receive such visitors, but the priory and everyone who lived there benefited from the gifts. What could she do? After some thought, a plan began to form. And when she was ready, she waited until the day of the week when all 3 men were due to visit. The first to arrive was the knight, fresh from his morning hunt and full of songs and poems he'd written her that day. But before he could start his rendition, she stopped him and told him how she'd had a change of heart, that she wished to be married, and that if he could prove his bravery to her and his commitment, then she would agree to take his hand. Well, this silenced the knight, and whilst he was lost for words, she explained what she wanted him to do. Down in the woods was a little chapel, rarely used. If he could wrap himself in a shroud, a funeral cloth, and lay out as if dead, and stay for the whole night without getting scared, then the next day she would marry him. The knight recovered himself, and without saying a word, ran home to find a shroud, and then to the woods to find the chapel. Later that day, there he was, laid out in front of the altar, wrapped up and dreaming of his life with his new wife. Next to arrive was Pastor John. His awkwardness irritated the prioress that day, and before he could creep across the room and take a seat, she stopped him and explained how she'd had a change of heart. But I do have a task to ask of you before I can agree to marry you. My, cousin has died and can't afford a burial or his final prayers. Could you go to the woods to the little chapel, dig him a grave, bury him and say his prayers? Pastor John nodded and headed to the woods, stopping at home only to gather his robes, his prayer book and a spade. And then what of the merchant, who barely waited to be let in that day, so keen was he to gaze upon his love? As he began to tell the prioress about the warmth of the sun, she stopped him and explained how she'd had a change of heart. But I do have a favour to ask before I can agree to marry you. There is a naughty priest saying the prayers and committing a burial to someone who hasn't paid for such a thing. Now, I don't want to get into trouble, but if you could go to the little chapel in the woods and scare him, frighten him to put him off, maybe you could dress up as the devil to give him a fright. The merchant was a little stunned and then began to smile at the mirth and the fun of it. Home he went to stir up his servants to make him a costume. And it wasn't long before he left, dressed in red, with a mask over his face, clothes for feet, and a tail sticking out of his rear. When he got to the woods, there by the chapel, he could see the priest digging the grave. By the looks of it, he'd almost finished. He crept into the chapel and stepped past the poor dead soul who laid out in front of the altar. He went to the back. In the darkness, he hid. It wasn't long before Pastor John came in, having finished his labours. He put on his robes and picked up his prayer book. But as he started, there came from the back an almighty roar as a figure in red, surely the devil, was coming towards him. Pastor John screamed, threw up his prayer book and left the chapel. The book landed with a thud in the stomach of the knight, who sat up and tried to uncover his eyes. The merchant, who'd been chuckling at the priest, suddenly saw a dead man sit up. He screamed and left the chapel. The knight, who had at last managed to uncover his eyes, just saw the devil run out of the chapel. Well, he couldn't stay here any longer. He got up and ran out. As he ran up the hill, he passed a priest who was puffing and panting, and so he headed into the woods. Then all of a sudden, was swept up to the top of a tree. He'd got caught in a net and was trapped, and as wriggle and try as he might, he couldn't set himself free. Whimpering, he stayed there for the rest of the night. Pastor John, he wasn't used to running. It wasn't long before he grew too hot, and he began to take off his robes and his clothes over his head. And then suddenly he was naked. He jumped into a bush to hide his modesty and stayed there for the rest of the night. The devil had witnessed the priest run up the hill, the dead body go into the forest, so he leapt over the nearest hedge. As he was catching his breath, he suddenly heard a thudding and a drumming, as if something large was coming towards him. It was a bull, and he was dressed in red. He got up and he ran. He ran for his life and leapt over the next hedge, straight into a stinking, muddy puddle. Exhausted, he fell asleep and spent the night there. And that's where our men stayed till morning. The next morning, the prioress waited for her visitors. The first to arrive was the knight, who admitted straight away that he hadn't completed the task she'd set him. "Oh dear," she said, "and I understand you spent the night whimpering in a net up a tree. That's not very good for your reputation. Perhaps we could agree that you continue to send your gifts to the priory, but you promise never to come and see me again." The knight left, having made this promise. "Pastor John," she said as she let him in, "I understand you spent the night naked in a bush. What would your parishioners think of that? Perhaps we could agree that you continue to send the wine, a charitable donation, to the priory, but you promise never to come and see me again." Pastor John agreed to this and was almost knocked over as he left by a large angry man who smelt of, he wouldn't like to say. "Ah," said the prioress, as the merchant stomped up the path. He handed over a bag of gold. "Lady Prioress, I will continue to send you my gifts, but I will never come and see you again." He turned, and with that was gone. And that is how the priory and all who lived there continued to be well fed, well stocked in wine and gold, but the lady prioress never saw her visitors again. Now, I must get on with my work and, well, you lot best be off.